UFOs, monsters, mysteries. You're listening to Talking Weird. And now, from a cabin deep in the Northwoods, your hosts, Dr. Dean Bertram and Jen Durrell.
Well, hey, baby.
Hey, baby.
Summer has arrived in the Northwoods a little prematurely. It is hot and humid and muggy tonight, but I like that.
It's muggy here too.
And my animals are going crazy. I told you
Yes.
before, two of my roosters
Mm-hmm.
decided to try to kill each other today in this cockfight that went for, I don't know, 30 minutes. In fact, I was on the phone to our guest tonight, who's also a good friend of mine. And I was like, my chickens are trying to murder me. Roosters are trying to murder each other. I had to go down and hose them down eventually because they were covered in blood and wouldn't stop. Yeah, it was nasty. It was like something out of, I don't know, one of those old 70s movies which would capture, like, what was that movie? Mondo Cane, you know that? Like those Mondo movies from Italy where they go and capture like cockfights and dog fights and all types of hideous things. It was like playing out in front of my eyes. My two best roosters trying to destroy each other. Anyway, how was your day? I know you were back at your work location, which we never mentioned, but were there any experiences there? Because I know sometimes some paranormal type stuff goes on there.
Kind of, sorta. I mean, we had a radio that wasn't playing at the time. It was like static. We were trying to figure that out. And when I stood right next to it, it came back on. So I don't mean, who knows? There's a lot of crazy stuff that happens.
Who does?
That's really not that paranormal-ish. So
I guess it's a state of mind as well, I suppose. If you're somewhere where you think things are paranormal, you're more likely to.
This is odd. Yeah.
You heard a knocking, though, you said as well, which you couldn't identify today. I think you told me.
We were in the office. Yeah. We
What
heard
happened?
a knock on the window, but we don't know what it was.
Huh. The ghost of Christmas past.
Who knows?
Strange.
Who knows?
Well, we're going to talk all kinds of weirdness tonight with our guest. I'm so delighted that we finally have him on. We planned to have him on at Midwest Weird Fest because he was there screening 2 of his films at the festival in Eau Claire this year. But I felt too guilty to drag him out of a screening to do the show on a Saturday night. Anyway, he's the writer, director, and producer of The Revenant, a film that garnered him 3 Best Director awards and several Best in Festival awards, over 27 in total, I believe. A number of those awards was at a festival where I first met him, a Night of Horror International Film Festival in Sydney, where I think it won Best Film, Best Director, Best Special Effect. In any way, it won a bunch of them. It certainly won Best Film and Best Director, which were the 2 most prestigious awards at that festival. Anyway, his other feature directing credits include Roadkill and The Blair Rabbit Project. He cut his teeth in Hollywood as a visual effects artist and makeup effects artist while working on establishing a writing and directing career. He is a graduate of UCLA's School of Film and Television. So I'm delighted to welcome to the show tonight my good friend, Kerry Prior. Mr. Prior, welcome to Talking Weird.
Thank you. That was scary.
Oh, yeah, the music.
Now you have to go and buy some T-shirts at our store, which you just saw the shameless ad plug for.
I'd do that.
It's so great to have you here. I framed actually the one of the albums. I still had a couple albums left over for those watching the show. I have the DVD somewhere. I couldn't find it. Here's the LP of The Revenant. It's such a spectacular movie.
Dude, you got to show them the disc, though. I mean, the disc is what it's all about.
Yeah.
I'll go and grab it by the end. When Jen's asking you a question during the show, I'll go and grab it. Because I've got a frame.
It's in there.
Oh, no, I mean, this one isn't open. This is the last one, which we didn't give away at the festival. When Tsunami Records and you kindly gave an LP of The Revenant to every member of the audience. It was such a wonderful screen.
Well, that was all Surumi Records. So.
Joey. How do you pronounce it? I always mispronounce it.
Surumi.
Surumi.
The T is silent, or you just slur it.
There you go. But it was such a joy playing The Revenant again after, I think it was 10 years before almost I played it in Sydney.
I think I mentioned to you, I was nervous. I didn't know how it was going to play. And I especially thought that the maybe social critique aspects of the movie that you and I discussed at your festival 10 years ago. I remember you pinning me down about like how are you going to approach this? You remember that?
I do, because I knew there'd be woke members of the audience who would be very critical, and sure enough, there was a couple. But you were the only film I've ever played in the history of. I've been running festivals now for goodness 15 years, and I've run a bunch. The Revenant is the only film I've ever screened when we screened it in Sydney in, I think, 2010, where the whole crowd stood up and kept applauding when you were on stage, and you were like bowing like, you know, you were Beethoven or something, you know, like, thank you. And they just wouldn't stop applauding. It was the only time,
like Beethoven.
You know what I mean? But it was like one of those, you know, amazing moments of the maestro on stage. And I've never seen that in all of my years.
Yeah, it was fun. Well, first of all, your audience was drunk. So that, but it did play well. But anyway, so Joey, Jeff Davis of Surumi Records, came to me after the screening, and he's like, you know, it's weird. I was worried about it, but he didn't know that I was worried about it. And he said, you know, I think that those aspects of it are even more relevant today, considering the, you know, socio-political issues that we're all living through right now. Sure. And I had the same thing. It was like on a certain level, I thought, geez, maybe this is really gonna, you know, not play. And yet somehow it was like, it was even more poignant, I felt.
Yeah, and I think the issues regarding crime and, you know, race relations and things like that in the movie, but also particularly, as I'm sure you'll agree with this even more than those aspects of it, the military industrial complex critique, which is in that movie. As you were saying now, I remember at the Q&A when we were talking about it in Eau Claire, those things seem even more relevant today than they did 10 years ago.
Yeah. I don't know that they are, because I think, for example, Iran has always been on the list, you know? And we're, you know, it's going to happen. Clearly, eventually, the United States is going to invade Iran, and there's going to be an issue there. So it's you know, it doesn't take a rocket surgeon to sort that out. Certainly, it was more the race stuff that I felt like, Jesus, today it's like that stuff's not going to play, and yet it was like it was somehow more, because all of those things are so much more ratcheted up now than they were 10 years ago. You know, like people, it's on television, it's on everybody's minds, I think.
Yeah. There's an incredible honesty in The Revenant, though, and anybody who hasn't seen it should hunt it down.
Yeah, that's the thing. Anybody who hasn't seen it has no idea what we're talking about. It won't make any sense.
And it's normally not talking politics. It's normally talking weird, although you and I, of course, can't help ourselves because it's almost a hobby for us. But to fill people in on what The Revenant is, what was your kind of elevator pitch back in the day when you get the project off the ground?
God, I can't even remember now. Frankly, I ran into that problem with the Q&A. Is like 10 years later, I kind of wasn't prepared for. It wasn't all like on the edge of my, you know, on the tip of my tongue. What was my elevator pitch? I guess it was like, I suppose it. Well, here's the thing. I remember when I was writing it, I had this sort of epiphanal moment where it was like, okay, wait a second. What if I get rid of everything in this that doesn't have a basis? Get rid of everything in it that has a basis in fiction. Like so much of what we know about vampires comes from cinema, really. And if not cinema, then literature. Things like famous tomes like Dracula. You know, I mean, so much of what we know about vampires is Dracula or the Vampire Lestat or all of that stuff. So I'm like, if you take all of that fiction and you just get rid of it, then you're left with things like A Treatise on Vampires and Revenants by, what was he, the Benedictine monk? See, here, it's been 10 years. I can't remember anymore. But that was at a time, that was written at a time, Dom Calmet. Okay. And he was hired by the Catholic Church, I believe, to write. He had written things on the Old Testament and the New Testament, and he was like one of those literary geniuses of the time. We're talking 1752 or something like that. And so apparently they had a problem with people like disinterring graves and pulling the bodies out because they were convinced that it was vampires. But, famous vampires like Arnold Paul, who was haunting his friends and relatives, and literally Don Calmet came to wherever it was, Bulgaria, or who knows, and went to this village and interviewed all his relatives. And then they disinterred the grave of Arnold Paul and realized his body wasn't rotting and all of this. So they like took it really seriously. So at a certain point in writing the thing, I'm like, okay, what if we just get rid of all of the fiction, everything we know to be fiction, and we just go with those ideas, like those sort of ancient things, and we really treat this as a real thing. Like, the body's not asleep at night. It's just, he's dead. Right during the day. At night he wakes up. And so then how do you deal with that? It just makes it way more fun dramatically when you like take all of those things seriously. Like, you don't cut any corners about the reality of how you have to deal with it.
Yeah, and that was.
I don't know. That's not much of an elevator pitch, but I mean,
no, but it lets people know
my approach.
Yeah, it lets people know the tone and the sense of the movie, and I find it so fascinating that, and I think we can talk about a number of your ideas, either realized or ideas I know that you're still developing, when it comes to how you do go back to original source material. I think to give the story a solid basis, whether in reality or not, but certainly in a belief system that's realer than something just invented by Bram Stoker in the 19th century, for example.
Yeah, right. I mean, I imagine probably that's what Bram Stoker did too, right? He probably was looking at those old legends and said, well, how do we make some fiction out of this? It's interesting though. I think at a certain point you kind of have to unbury yourself from all that fiction. It's just certainly, at least for me, it's always way more interesting and more constructive to pivot around reality, as much as possible, whether it's an emotional reality or like a literal reality, whatever, to keep things real tight.
Yeah, and I think that is the difference from The Revenant to, be it a hyper romanticized version of vampires, like what's that series, True Blood or Twilight, or even Stoker's was very romanticized. There's no romanticism. Yeah. Well, there's romanticism in the sense that there's a strong friendship in The Revenant, and there's somebody who loves his girlfriend, but there isn't the romanticized idea that the vampire is somehow incredibly sexually appealing and can mesmerize you with a look or something. Yeah,
that came later, didn't it? Yeah.
And going back to those old Eastern European legends, those bloated corpses that came out of the ground to prey on their family and other villagers, they were never, charming counts. They were hideous, shambling creatures.
Yeah. And essentially tormenting their loved ones. Like they came back from the dead to just torment their loved ones, to fuck with them. Which is that's basically that's what Bart does in The Revenant.
I think I think that's part of the genius of The Revenant. You don't really, and I don't want to do any spoilers because people need to watch the movie, but you don't really realize that's what Bart's, I don't think, intending on doing it, but that's absolutely what he does. Him coming back from the dead wreaks havoc on his loved ones.
Yeah, he's a dick.
Oh, fantastic. And so it's interesting because you obviously have to keep a distance as far as, well, you don't have to, but I suspect that you do. When you're investigating, and like I said, we'll talk about some other paranormal things that are influencing some of your projects, but when you're investigating these things, do you feel yourself ever falling into a belief mode? Like you're like, maybe there really were vampires in Eastern Europe back in the 17th century.
Sure. I mean, I like to think, I like to try and be a open-minded critic about all things. So I try to be open-minded to all ideas and yet poke holes in them all. Right. I just think it's a healthy way to approach stuff. I don't accept anything at face value if somebody just tells me something or whatever. And yet I think that everything needs, you need to take an epistemological approach to everything and, shake it and see what falls loose. So, but yeah, I will read things, and there are certainly things probably we'll get to later tonight that I read them and I'm like, wow, I think I'm sort of sold on that to some extent. Well, to some extent, I'm not sold on anything completely. There's nothing I believe completely, and maybe conversely, there's very little that I completely discount either. But
I know another.
But yeah,
sorry, you continue.
No, there's some things I give some credence to. I'll let you know when we come across them.
Well, I know something you're interested in, which is perhaps a more believed in aspect of the paranormal today, and that is
I know where
Bigfoot.
You're going with this.
Well, I'm going Bigfoot first because I know that you had, which I'm not going to spoil because I know it's something you've talked about, it's in development, but I don't want anyone to steal your idea. But you had a fantastic Bigfoot fictional narrative film you pitched to me once, and I also know you were on the cusp of doing a Bigfoot documentary.
Yeah, well, the Bigfoot documentary, and I believe this is how all documentaries should work, kind of fell into my lap. But I don't mind pitch. I've kind of, well, I can pitch that idea. I have another Bigfoot idea, which I really love for I guess it would be for like an hourly episodic series. That's what I'm thinking. And frankly, I don't know how much it really has to do with Bigfoot lore. So I won't go into that because I just love this idea and I really want to get this made. But the other one, I had this idea, like, when you look at the budgets of big budget Hollywood movies, you're spending $200 million on like a Marvel movie or whatever, right? I mean, $200 million is a chunk of change. If, say, Disney gave me $200 million and said, make a Bigfoot movie, I'd spend $100 million going and catching the motherfucker.
Yeah.
Because that would make a good movie.
Yep.
And I think for $100 million, yes, I could catch Bigfoot if he existed, which then we might get into trouble. Like, Kerry, we're looking at your budget. We see you've blown $100 million. What do you have to show for it? Well, we set up some trail cams. So anyway, but what I really thought was that would actually make a better fictional idea where some jackass like me goes to a studio and says, I'm going to make you a fictional movie. I'm going to need, $200 million. And then instead of filming that movie, goes and tries to find Bigfoot. So I had this whole plot laid out where they go and they, are spending like shit tons of money going up into the, mountains of Washington or wherever, looking for Bigfoot. And then they managed to accidentally capture, maybe kill, I don't remember how it went, a baby Bigfoot or, whatever, an adolescent Bigfoot, which is like, it's all fine and well, except that mom and dad then come after you to get the fucking baby back. And now you're in trouble.
Fantastic.
So that was my Bigfoot screenplay pitch.
Somebody needs to give you $100 million to make that movie, or $200 million so you can take 100 and just search for it.
Right, yeah, right. This is what makes it so meta, because the screenplay would read the way I pitched it to you, but then I would really go out and try and catch Bigfoot.
Well, you know what? I think that's the fourth Bigfoot idea, or at least the third I've heard from you now. So you've just loaded.
Really?
With, yeah. I don't want to. I didn't know how. I'll tell you off air because I don't know if that's one you don't want to pitch or not. But tell us a little bit about the document. Can you talk a little bit about the documentary?
Yeah.
Bigfoot.
Well, I can because the guy blew me off, so I kind of feel like I'm sort of released from any kind of. Anyway, so knowing my love for Bigfoot, and I do love Bigfoot. I mean, look, at Bigfoot was a big deal in the 70s. I mean, we all know where Chewbacca came from,
right?
I mean, that's not a stretch.
Yeah.
Frankly, we know where the Jawas came from too, but that's a different podcast.
Phantasm.
Phantasm? No, what I would have said is Dune.
Does Phantasm come after? I'm sorry, I'm trying to.
I think both. Well, that's a good question.
Gosh, yeah.
But I think both of those came from Dune. Didn't the Dune characters have glowing eyes?
Okay, there you go.
Yeah.
See, Kerry, for the audience who don't know, also worked on Don Coscarelli's Phantasm film, so I thought maybe you had an inside track. But then when I think about it, I'm not sure if the first Phantasm might have come out after Star Wars.
Yeah,
actually.
I was like 11 when the first one came out or something.
Phantasm's an infinitely better film than Star Wars, by the way.
Yes.
No, it is. I mean, I can watch
yeah.
Phantasm every day of my life and never be
All
bored.
credit to Don Coscarelli. Yeah.
Yeah, fantastic. Anyway, so what route were we going on? We were going down the Bigfoot documentary route.
So something about Bigfoot.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. So anyway, so some friends of mine had knowing my love for Bigfoot, sent me an article from one of the Cleveland papers here talking about some fellow who as a matter of fact, what it was, they got a police report. Somebody had called the police and said, there's a Bigfoot. There's a Bigfoot in my house or in my yard or something. I don't know why I'm laughing. It's a very serious matter. And so the police went and they took a report from this guy. And the paper did not interview the guy. They interviewed the police. The police told them what was in the report. So they didn't mention the guy's name, but they did mention the road. And the report went something to the effect of, hey, there's this Bigfoot. And frankly, I've been feeding them bananas. And so it's really not funny. And so he keeps coming back. And, he tried to get through my door. And so I had to shoot my gun at him to drive him away. It was this whole thing, right? And so I'm looking at this and I'm going, oh my God. And so, but they did have the road that he was on, which is right outside of Chagrin Falls, which is where I live, which you're quite familiar with. It's right. Walking distance from my house in Chagrin Falls. And I'm going, what? There's Sasquatch incidents walking distance from my house? So I'm like, so I look up this road and I realize it's like right next to this park. And I'm going, wait a second, this sounds real familiar. And so this is like I'm just sort of like tipping my cards as to what a dork I am. But I'm like, I know I read this report on BFRO, Bigfoot Research Organization's website. And I'm like, I know that there was another sighting here. So I go there and you can look it up by like the region. Mm-hmm. And sure enough, I find it on the street. And based on that, I find the guy's name, by the way, from 19 years ago.
Wow.
And I'm going, so wait a second. You're telling me this guy has had a Sasquatch, I don't know, pest control issue for the last 19 years? And I'm going, no way. So I just like Google searched this guy's name. I found his address and I found his phone number just, on Google. And so I called the guy up. I'm in California. And I call this guy and he picks up. And I'm like, so I read this article. So what, tell me about this. And he tells me this whole story. He's like, and again, I wanted to interview him. I'm like, this is perfect. I'm going to go home. I'm going to make a documentary about this. I know some guys. I'll hire a film crew. We're going to go interview him. And so it never happened. So I don't feel bad telling about this story. I'm not going to mention his name, but he tells me this whole story. We were on the phone for an hour. There's a family of Bigfoot that live outside of his house. And he has been, again, leaving treats for them outside.
They like the treats, the Sasquatch.
Yeah, bananas and stuff, which makes sense, I suppose. And so I guess you're not supposed to feed the wildlife. There's a good reason for that, because they started getting too friendly. And apparently they busted into his house. And he says, in retrospect, I realized that my wife left me because Bigfoot was inside my house. I'm not shitting you. This is the real story. I'm not sure you should be laughing at this. If Bigfoot were in your way, oh boy. Anyway, did she live with Bigfoot? Was that the kind of what he intimated was that he felt his wife left him because yes, Bigfoot was getting into their house and she didn't feel comfortable with that.
Oh, I thought it was because he didn't only have a big foot, perhaps. Just
I mean, I don't feel we should speculate. Put
No,
it
I
that
don't
way.
think we really can. Good gracious. It's such a shame you weren't able to make that documentary.
Well,
that
so
guy
here's the
blew you
thing.
off.
I got back here. I literally called some guys. I'm like, hey, I've got this amazing documentary. I didn't tell them what it was because I felt like somehow the reaction of the film crew to this story is part of the story. And so I didn't tell him what it was. I'm just like, I've got this thing. I don't know when we're going to be able to film, but I need a crew. We put this crew together. And then I kept calling this guy and he stopped returning my calls. And I'm not sure what happened because, by the way, we're laughing about it now, but I was utterly sincere in my curiosity about this story. And I really wanted to hear what he had to say. And quite frankly, was ready to believe under the right circumstances. I think what I envisioned was that he would tell me this story and possibly lead me out into the woods and maybe, show me. It's kind of a swampy area, from what I've heard about Bigfoot. It kind of would make sense that Bigfoot would, tromp around in that area. It seems a little, a bit of a stretch to think that he would be so close to literally my house in Chagrin Falls. But, I don't know. Ohio has the third highest number of Bigfoot sightings of any state in the United States. So,
yeah, it's
the
Grass Man, right? Don't you call him there? Isn't he called the Ohio Grass Man?
I think you're right. Yeah, in Southern Ohio. Yeah.
Yeah. You know what? Bringing up the point of it's strange that it's just down the road in Chagrin Falls. There was a Bigfoot sighting even just up the road from me. And as you know, I'm a little more rural than Chagrin Falls, but it's difficult for me to imagine if Bigfoot is a real physical wild man ape, that he would be able to maintain existence in the habitat he has even here. So I think when it was always out in the Pacific Northwest, as it seemed to be, and up in Canada with these massive tracts of, essentially untrod land, there was a little more believability that it was a physical entity. Now, I'm not discounting that people see Bigfoot in all kinds of places, including potentially Chagrin Falls, including up the road from me. But the idea of a population distribution in areas, I mean, they see them in every state of the lower 48, right? There are places where it's almost inconceivable to think a Bigfoot population could exist in the United States. That doesn't make me think that people aren't experiencing something. It's just hard for me to believe that whatever it is a physical ape man hiding in the woods.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's quite frankly for me what makes the whole legend so attractive is that on one hand, and here I'm going to try and be the, critical skeptic. It's completely I mean, look there have been several species of intelligent bipedal, advanced human-like creatures in the course of history. We assume that they, all but one anyway, have died off at this point. But you can't disprove the existence of something.
Sure.
So, I mean, it's perfectly credible to think that that creature could exist. What's not especially credible is to think that it could exist in tandem with a modern society in North America and people wouldn't know about it. That's the part that's tough to wrap your head around. And so then when you hear about, there's a Sasquatch, eating bananas off of a guy's porch in Chagrin Falls, or a skunk ape in Florida tormenting tourists. It's that stretches my credulity a bit.
Yes,
but again, that's what makes it so interesting is that on one hand, totally believable. On the other hand, incredible.
Yeah, see, I don't necessarily doubt the people who have the sightings. I don't think they're all crazy or seeing things or mistaking a bear for a Bigfoot, but I tend to look at a lot of this phenomenon as the same, that maybe it's some type of exteriorization of our own psyches, or maybe it's some external force which somehow just manifests for us to see at times, maybe even manifests to a physical state for a minute before it does something else, because people are seeing these things. I don't know if that guy you were talking to was actually plagued by Bigfoot in Chagrin Falls, but maybe he was. But maybe it isn't that it's a man-ape, but maybe it's the same as a family being plagued by poltergeist activity, or an alien abductee having an experience in his bedroom at night. Maybe it's something which is a far stranger phenomenon that a lot of Bigfoot researchers, or a lot of UFO researchers, or a lot of specter chasers are prepared to acknowledge. Maybe it's indicative of a far deeper mystery than most people are even looking at. But anyway, that was a fascinating Bigfoot tale.
I suspect what maybe saddens me about it is that I think we probably won't know. I tend to think that it's a thing, that there's actually some kind of creature out there. But then again, I don't know. You know, I've read enough stuff where it's, how do they disappear? How do they, you know, I mean, there's like, what is it, Ape Canyon in
I was
Washington?
going to bring that up. It's one of my favorite stories. I was actually just reading tonight before, when I was waiting for the show, a kind of mini book zine put out by a researcher called Mark Marcel, who we're going to have on the show. And he was the guy who went and found where that cabin still is. And he's dug up all of this research about what happened in Ape Canyon. It seems like something really happened at Ape Canyon. But it's hard to believe that there were physical ape men there and still there. You know, it's just it's very strange. And incidentally, incidentally, the guy, one of the central guys in that story, I think his name's Fred Beck. He wrote his own story in 1967 with the help of his son, recounting what happened to him at Ape Canyon. And he, interestingly, said that it wasn't physical. There were real ape men there, but they weren't like, you know, ape men. They just appeared as ape men, and they belonged to another dimension or something weird. He took a very strange spiritual interpretation. And that's the guy who said he shot one and it fell off the canyon and tumbled down.
Right.
So
and then it was something like 40 years later that he wrote this thing.
That's right.
And clearly he was also into spiritualism.
That's absolutely true. You know, so okay.
Yeah. And it's spiritualism in the classical sense, the like late 1800s, when who were those three girls who were
the Fox sisters?
Oh yeah,
cracking their knuckles and essentially gave birth to spiritualism. Just fake. It was totally faked. Anyway, so he was into that kind of spiritualism, and you know, I don't know. This is what's interesting. All this stuff is kind of connected, right? I mean, I don't know that. Yeah, this is what I find so intriguing about Bigfoot. But frankly, I feel we'll never know. I don't think anybody's going to bag a Bigfoot. So the $200 million would be ill spent on my movie.
Man, imagine if you were the one who bagged it, though.
I think a lot of people imagine that. I think a lot of people.
I'm sure.
A lot of people imagine themselves like, I don't know, holding up Bigfoot's head for the television cameras or something. I don't know.
What about the Minnesota Iceman? What's your take on that?
Boy, it's intriguing. I don't know. You know, I mean, there's a lot of speculation about that, right? Some people say, oh, well, it was actually a body that was shipped in from Korea or Vietnam or something like that. Look, here's what's credible about it is, so I'm assuming I don't have to give a summary for the audience, but essentially this guy had I don't remember his name, but he had a hairy ape man that he carried around in a glass refrigerated cabinet. This guy was a tractor salesman, if I remember correctly. And he would go to these, you know, county fairs, and somehow he had this creature in a box. And so I guess he kept calling people, and no universities or proper scientific, you know, institutions would take him seriously. And finally, a couple of guys heard about this, and they're like, you know, let's just go take a look at this. And so they go and they look at this box, and he wouldn't let them open it, but they had to look through the glass. And when they looked through the glass, they're like, yeah, this is something that deserves attention. This isn't fake. It's not a rubber monster. there's some shit in this box.
Yeah.
And so they wrote this thing about it. And then I guess they went to go get more research money or a grant or something. Anyway, and this guy sort of absconded with his ape man body. And I guess the story is he was going over to more fairs and he went to Canada. And when he came back from Canada, it was a rubber ape body.
Uh-huh.
And I think there's credible evidence to show that he paid some Hollywood effects guy to recreate the body, and then he was just taking around a rubber replacement in place of this thing. There's something else about, like, maybe when these guys came and photographed, the lights from their cameras cracked the glass. Does that sound familiar?
Maybe. I know Ivan Sanderson was one of the guys. I always forget the other guy. Ivan Sanderson was.
And they wrote a book about it, and I think the book was called. I haven't read it, but I think the book was called The Minnesota Iceman.
Okay, I haven't read it either. You know, that leads to another interesting point. And you're the only person we've ever had on this show who has a professional background who can answer this question I'm about to ask you, is that you're somebody with a background, a serious Hollywood level background in special effects and visual effects and makeup and the like. When you look at the Patterson Gimlin footage, what's your initial or what's your gut reaction to that footage?
Well, it's funny because that was a turning point in my interest in Bigfoot. You know, I, as a kid, obviously grew up with, you know, Chewbacca and that Patterson footage, you know, and it was like, of course, as a kid, I was, how can you not, you know, think Bigfoot's cool? Mm-hmm. Bigfoot is cool. There's no two ways around it.
And the Bionic Man as well.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Of course, and obviously Bigfoot's a robot. But anyway, so years ago, 20 years ago or something like that, I came home. My grandmother was sick. So I came home just to like spend some time here in Ohio. And I never watched TV. You know that about me. But my parents had cable television. So one night I was up late looking at some, I don't know, probably a History Channel monster show or something ridiculous. And they showed that Patterson footage. And, you know, I hadn't seen it since I was a kid because I didn't think about it. It was one of those things that was just always in the background of my youth, that Patterson footage. Bigfoot walking, looking across her shoulder or whatever. And so anyway, so this show, and by this time I'd been in the industry for probably at that point 20 years doing makeup effects and visual effects and shit. And I looked at that thing and I'm like I had this epiphany. Like, I don't know what that is, but it's not a guy in a suit. Huh. And I suddenly became super interested in Bigfoot as a result of just looking at that Patterson footage. So somehow I started calling around. I should have busted this out. I have a file on this. I started calling around and I found a guy who was working. I'm going to get all the details wrong because it's 20 years ago now. But this guy was working, researching the Patterson Gimlin footage. And he was specifically looking at, they had some questions about, was it shot on a reversal film or was it shot on negative film? If it was shot on negative film, then where's the camera original? Because that doesn't seem to exist. How many copies were made? What lab was it taken to? And most importantly, what was the frame rate that was taken at? And so since I was an expert on cameras and movie film, and especially, 16 millimeter and visual effects and all this stuff, I mean, part of the reason that I got those Phantasm jobs was because I loved practical effects. And I was into shit like the Shuftan technique and all of these like old style visual effects where you weren't doing necessarily composites and that kind of thing, but approaching it from quite frankly, a cheaper way. And in the beginning of cinema, the only way you could do some of those things. So I had this ongoing conversation with this guy about like, well, because obviously if it was shot at 18 frames a second and then it was projected at 24, well, it's going to look like it's a smaller person. And conversely, if it's shot at a higher frame rate and projected at a lower frame rate, it's going to look like a bigger person. And so and then there are certain cameras that have you can't just dial up the frame rate. It's like 16, 18, 24. That's what you've got. Like There's a switch and there's
Mhm.
3 positions. So that made it important to know what camera it was. By the way, most of these questions were virtually unanswerable, right? Because none of this stuff existed anymore. The camera original, which I assume was reversal film, because I don't think Patterson and Gimlin, knew fuck all about movies or anything, film. So I imagine they were not using negative film, but they were using reversal.
Mhm.
And if that's the case, then probably I think it's like Roger Patterson's mom ended up with the camera original, and then they were made. You understand the difference between a reversal and negative?
I certainly do, but you might want to tell the audience. So.
Okay, so just as a quick primer on motion picture film. So when you've got film, it's like plastic basically, and it's imbued with metal silver halide. And when light hits the silver halide, it turns dark. So that means that anything in the frame that is light, like the sky, turns dark. And that's why you have a negative. And anything that doesn't get exposed, then that silver halide doesn't turn dark. It stays light. That's why the image is negative. So then if you want to create a positive image from that, all you have to do is shoot that negative image on another piece of film, and it becomes a positive image. So your negative is your camera original. You then have a print, which is a positive. You can then make, more negatives, like what they call inner negatives from that, and you can make more prints from your inner negative. So if you cared about, for example, if I were out shooting movie film trying to get Bigfoot, like if someone gave me $200 million, for example, I would be using camera negative. Actually, I would be shooting digital now, but the point is I would be shooting camera negative because you can then take and squirrel that negative away and you just have your print, and you can make as many prints as you want from the negative. Whereas if you have reversal film, it's essentially camera negative, and it's a different chemical composition. They put it through a bath and it rinses away the silver halide, and now it gives you a positive image. The image really isn't as good. It looks different than a print that you take from a negative. It's virtually impossible to look at the Patterson Gimlin footage and go, oh yeah, that's reversal, not a print made from negative. But this was the subject of the conversation I was having back and forth with this guy for a long time. Somehow we dropped that conversation. It was an email conversation mostly. I think I talked to him on the phone a couple of times. And then years later, I believe what happened with this, I can't remember his name, by the way. Irish last name. Anyway, I kept all these emails. I got them in a file somewhere. But I think he finally came to this is what he said. He said he thought he saw a zipper, I think, on the back of the suit. And so he had been converted, and he no longer believed that it was really Bigfoot.
Yeah.
And Patty, I guess they call that Bigfoot, don't they? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So he now thought Patty was a guy in a suit. And I thought, there's no fucking way you can see a fucking zipper on that thing. It's so grainy, and they talk about her having breasts, and I'm like, I can barely see that. It could be I don't know.
A tumor.
It could be
Not a tumor.
Exactly. So I don't know. I mean, again, I look at that. I don't think it's a guy in a suit. If it's not a guy in a suit, what is it?
Uh-huh. Yeah, that's probably the closest thing I guess we really have to a smoking gun for Bigfoot these days. It's still that Patterson Gimlin footage. Yeah. I do lean to that it might be a hoax, but that said, the one thing that makes me think it mightn't be is that terrain is clearly difficult terrain, and that thing moves pretty elegantly for a guy in a suit over difficult, rocky, uncertain terrain. Like, I can't imagine walking that smoothly if you put me in a Bigfoot suit and had me walking over a creek bed with, boulders and rocks and tree branches and everything else. So that's,
and also somehow the way, well, again, you say the way the fur, I was going to say the way the fur lays, but that's not really fair because frankly, I think it's too grainy to make that statement. But I will say that the way the sun reacts to either the fur or the suit somehow makes it look like it's there's muscle and flesh under that, as opposed to it's just a bag with a body in it, which is kind of how suits look to me.
Do you think, I know a couple of people have come forward claiming that I think there's one or two people have come forward now claiming that they made the suit that was used, and it hasn't, obviously, how can you authenticate that one way or another? But with your knowledge of the history of special effects in Hollywood, was there somebody at the time that you think could have pulled off something close to that?
I guess here's my answer to that, which I'm still formulating.
That's a tough one.
Is it possible? Yeah, I do think it's possible. And here's why. Because I don't think there's enough information in that chunk of film to either prove or disprove what that is.
Because I know I know at the time, though, effects weren't like they are now. There weren't all the Rick Botons and all these other people. You know what I mean? Like, ape suits looked far faker in movies then than they probably would now.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, and somebody tried to say that one of the big makeup effects guys at the time, I forget who they said they thought did it.
Okay.
One of the more famous guys. I'm forgetting the whole modern legend now, but they tried to say, yeah, it was so-and-so. And I think that guy denied it, but if he had been paid the right amount of money to keep it secret, he would have denied it. I don't know. This is the thing. When you have, 2D film footage of something, there's only so much, it doesn't prove anything. That's the problem.
Uh-huh.
Now, back then, it was more credible. And this is the thing. It's not going to prove or disprove what that is. But it is going to give you sort of and which is what it did to me. It spurred my imagination because I'm like, I looked at it and my opinion was that was not a guy in a suit. So if it's not a guy in a suit, then it's there's only so many choices. But does that mean it was impossible? No. And again, there's only so much information you can get from a chunk of film. And that's why scientists or whomever rightfully say, yeah, when you bring me its head and we can do I think that's what was his name? Who was the guy? This is one of the books that I read right after this. I became super into Bigfoot. Not Kramer. What was the guy's name with a K though? He's dead now. They're all dead now.
Yeah, they almost all are.
Anyway, his whole thing was, because people were like, oh, well, if you're going to go hunt it, you should use a dart gun because you don't want to kill it. And this guy was like, no, fuck that. Kill the thing, bring it back so we can study it, and then we'll prove that it exists. And then we can put all kinds of laws into effect saying that you're not allowed to hunt it. But until then, if you go and try and bag it with like a dart, like it's going to turn around and kill you or something. He's like, just don't even bother. I can't remember that guy's name. I feel embarrassed.
No, I think it's one of the Four Horsemen. It's not Peter, the Four Horsemen of Bigfoot lore. So it's not Peter Byrne. It's not John Green. Though both of those guys were very peaceful in their approach. I know who it is. So I have one of his books downstairs. I don't want to run downstairs and grab them. I know who you mean. But on an entirely different tack. If you get it, let me know. But on an entirely different tack, one of the things we led this in the artwork anyway for this episode, which of course we can always change, was you and I have been chatting a lot about UFO disclosure lately, just in private conversations. Do you want to talk a little bit about that and what your take is, and all these people coming forward with this certainty that the US government has this real footage and we've seen it, and they're as good as told us that UFOs are real, which normally means UFOs are extraterrestrial, or that tends to be what people mean when they say UFOs are real.
I think you know very well how I feel about that.
I just want you to tell our audience.
It's bullshit. It's fucking bullshit, you retards. No, there's Look, and by the way, this is not to say that I don't believe in UFOs or life from other planets or whatever. We can get into that, right? I'm happy to. It's a fun subject. Frankly, I think the Nazis are behind part of it. And by the way, we can go back to.
Have we lost Kerry?
Uh-oh.
There you go. See, this is what used to happen on Art Bell when somebody was telling too much of the truth. I'm serious. They took him out. Started
Yep.
talking about the true history of UFOs.
Yeah. On my end, he's white. It's a white screen.
It's
so-
just a black screen here.
I
We will
don't know.
stand by. But I think Kerry and I have talked a lot about UFO disclosure lately, and so many people seem so certain that it's about to come, or the US government is already kind of starting to do it in stages. But I suppose my point as a UFO historian would be there's been lots of periods throughout the history of UFO belief since 1947. It probably became popular to believe it was extraterrestrial by the early 1950s. But disclosure has never come. And I've always said I'd be suspicious the day disclosure did come, because I would wonder if it wasn't some kind of psyop. You know, there's those famous, I think 2 or 3 speeches by Ronald Reagan, and Reagan said, wouldn't it be wonderful if we had an alien invasion, because it would be this unifying threat for humanity to come together. I'm not even sure if that's the way it would be used. There's certainly what might very well be a hoax. It's a book, I think it was first printed or discovered in the 1960s, called The Report from Iron Mountain. And it's essentially, it reads like it's a secret study panel deciding or game playing ways that you can manipulate populations. And one of the things just mentioned in passing, like I think it's only a paragraph in that book. I haven't read it since I was doing my PhD 20 years ago or something now. But one of the things in passing in that book is, well, we could do the old extraterrestrial, stage. If Kerry does call back, you'll be able to.
Yeah.
Be able to hit him in there.
I think he finally realized it.
Oh, maybe he was talking and it all.
Yeah, I think so too. He probably realized it.
But so I think Kerry and I are both fairly suspicious of this current race towards disclosure, or what people think is a race towards disclosure. Just because something looks strange on video, or just because somebody with a US government connection comes forward and says, we know that they're not ours. I mean, that doesn't mean anything. I mean, we had Rick Doty on the show once, and Rick Doty will assert that it is genuine and there is a genuine extraterrestrial presence. But certainly Doty was involved with spinning tales of extraterrestrial presence. There you are, you're back. I was filling in, Kerry. I was just babbling about disclosure. That's okay. We have you back now. So I think you were saying that I was just saying that both you and I tend to be suspicious that just because somebody with US government intelligence connections, or just because people interpret a piece of footage as something which isn't ours, it means that all of a sudden there's extraterrestrials hovering around in our airspace.
Well, let me dispense with the obvious logical fallacy, although it tends to be a guidepost for me in these things, which is when you have an entity like our government that lies to us about virtually everything, and then they come to us saying, hey, guess what, guys, UFOs, that doesn't prove that it doesn't prove that there's no such thing as UFOs, but I'm skeptical. So I got my feet wet, and look, like any, I love Chewbacca. I also love Close Encounters of the Third Kind.
Great movie.
But I got my feet wet in UFO folklore when
I think Kerry's breaking up on my end again. Is he breaking up for you, Jen?
Yeah.
We lost you then, Kerry, for a minute again.
Am I back again?
You're back now.
Yes.
You were saying you wet your feet with Close Encounters of the Third Kind, or that piqued your interest, and then you moved on to something else. We didn't hear that.
It's better.
Oh.
You've frozen again.
Oh no.
Oh no. This happens sometimes with the live broadcast. So I think Kerry's point's very relevant about trusting the government to necessarily tell you the truth. And what fascinates me with UFO believers, if they've assumed that the US government has been lying to us about an extraterrestrial presence or extraterrestrial visitation or a relationship we've had with extraterrestrials for the last however many years, it seems very strange that you would immediately trust that same government when they start to tell you a different version of the story.
Right.
Do you know what I mean? Like, why trust them when they're saying, well, maybe they are real, and why didn't you trust them when they said they're not real? So I think it's a mistake to instantly believe somebody because they're telling you something that you want to hear. It's a very human thing to do. I mean, we all do it. If somebody is agreeing with you, you tend to like them more. It's psychology 101. You tend to like them more. You tend to feel an affiliation with them, and you tend to trust them.
Right.
So I think there's so many people that I remember when I did my PhD on UFO belief back in the 90s into the 2000s, there were polls in America where well over 50% of people believed in flying saucers as a genuine extraterrestrial presence in this country or in the world. So there's a lot of people that are going to eagerly adapt or adopt that information when it's given by sources that say or sources that do have a background in the intelligence or the military industrial complex. So I think people need to be very careful before they get too excited that all of a sudden, just because there's a couple of videos that look like there's a strange craft that can't be explained that supposedly a naval pilot's chasing, maybe they really were. That doesn't mean it's necessarily real or not ours or a psyop or something else. So I've never thought disclosure would come, but if it comes, I'll certainly be suspicious of who tells me.
Right. Yeah, but you can't really explain it though. They've got video.
They
of
do.
Crafts.
They do have video, but if I had film footage back in, I don't know, the early 19 teens of a jet plane from the 1950s, you wouldn't have been, or the 1940s, you wouldn't have been able to explain it either. So we have a black budget in the United States of America for the defense projects, which is in the billions, which just goes into places we never know where it goes. So to think that what we see flying over a football game on the 4th of July is the state of art aerial technology that we have is just, it's naive. So just because something's operating at an incredible speed or doing incredible maneuvers, particularly with the advancement that we have in unmanned aerial craft, like even drone technology today that you can buy in Walmart for $100 was unthinkable 20 years ago or even 10 years ago. So you just have to wonder, what have these black projects actually developed? So I'm not sure if I'm instantly prepared. There's a little moth flying around. It's not a UFO for those watching. I don't think you instantly have to make that enormous jump from we don't know what it is and it seems to be beyond our current technological capabilities to, well, it must be extraterrestrial or interdimensional or wherever you want to believe these things come from. Because I'm pretty sure that the black projects in this country have technology which is a good thing. We want to be able to defend freedom and, have wonderful technology that's better than our enemies. I'm not even saying it's a bad thing, but to assume that when we see something we can't identify, it's extraterrestrial, is crazy. We know in the 1960s when they were testing things like, was it the U-2 spy planes and things, the CIA knew a massive amount of flying saucer reports with the US military testing this kind of technology, and they liked the idea and they spun it. You see it even more recently with Area 51 when people start saying, oh, there's strange lights there. It's so clear that this story was worthwhile them spinning as extraterrestrial craft being back engineered, because nobody takes it seriously then, including our enemies, which is a good thing again. But if you said, oh yeah, what you're seeing is those lights is something we've been trying to develop for 20 years. Mr. Prior returns again.
Sorry, guys.
That's all right. This happens with technology. You've missed all my UFO rants though.
Yeah.
I've just been.
I heard your last bit of it, which I agree with, by the way.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And
well, I guess that's the point. Is like here all of a sudden. They've been working up to this for the last couple of years, right? So suddenly the mainstream media is taking seriously UFO reports, right? Whereas for the last 20 years, it's been anytime you bring it up, they mock it. It's always with a joke or tongue in cheek or, it's, oh, so-and-so saw a UFO, and there'll be, Oh, I bet they were little green men. Whatever. They make fun of it.
Mhm.
And now all of a sudden they're not making fun of it. All of a sudden.
Mhm.
They've all agreed, hey, guess what, guys? We're going to take this seriously now.
Yeah, there's a clear talking point that's come down from somewhere which everybody's following at the moment, I think.
Yeah.
As we see in all kinds of things, I mean, it's the way we're played as a species. You know what I didn't get to talk to you about, and maybe we can do it before we sign out, is I know you had a film project, which I think is still in development. So again, I'm not going to spoil it, but it involved some kind of mind control. And so the obvious question is, and I know you have an interest in it, so I'm being a bit disingenuous pretending that I don't know, but what's your take on things like MK Ultra and various ideas? Because clearly, we're just talking about, the media manipulate people at a very obvious level, but there might be other deeper levels of manipulation of our at a subconscious level, or at an even more sinister, perhaps drug-induced level or something. So tell me a little bit about what you know about those kind of projects.
Well, so I read a handful of books about MK Ultra when I was doing research for Super Alpha Kill 666, which is a movie that I'm in development in right now. And we know that MK Ultra happened and was a thing, and there's probably plenty of evidence to show that those experiments, number one, started in Germany with the Nazis, and that a lot of those Nazis weren't persecuted for war crimes, and instead came here and started working on projects like at NASA and for the CIA with MK Ultra, right? I mean, none of this is a secret. Everybody knows about MK Ultra now, and it's not. I mean, they've had hearings about it. It's like it's a real thing, right? It's not pretend. It's interesting that they're kind of trying to now dilute it. Like Stranger Things. They called that MK Ultra, and so there was a magical lab where they were doing all this stuff. All they're trying to do there is just cartoon the thing, make it seem like it's ridiculous, right? Because that story didn't tell anything about what they were really doing in MK Ultra. And what they were doing in MK Ultra was mind control. They were trying to figure out how to control people, and they were using drugs and hypnotism and torture. Those are basically the three things that they were doing. So this guy wrote this book. I've got it right here. John Marks, The Search for the Manchurian Candidate. Well, John Marks started looking into this. He'd heard about it. And by this time, they had officially disbanded MK Ultra. This book was published in 1972 or something like that. And so none of the records about what they did in the experiments existed anymore. The official records had been shredded. But apparently they accidentally forgot to destroy 2 file boxes of financial receipts. And so he looked through those financial receipts and found names of people, and he went and he interviewed those people, and that's how he wrote the book. And so he got firsthand accounts from a lot of these people about what they were doing. There's no official accounts because they destroyed all this stuff. But effectively what they were doing is they were using LSD. The CIA was the first group to get a contract for manufacturing LSD from Sandoz Laboratories in Switzerland, who had invented it. Albert Hofmann was the scientist, the chemist who figured it out. He used a fungus that was growing on rye and created LSD. And they started using it for therapeutic purposes. Famously, Cary Grant dosed on LSD, I don't know, like 125 times or something. And he said it was the most important thing he ever did in his life. And it was and he was doing it for therapeutic purposes, right? He was incredibly depressed. He was like 60 years old, decided he wasn't going to act anymore, and was horribly depressed. And so he started doing this, revolutionary therapy in the late 1950s. And he was dosing on LSD. Well, the CIA under MK Ultra took LSD to all the major universities in the United States and in the UK, and they either made full on deals with them, like, please use this to experiment in your psychiatric laboratories, or they secretly funded it and those companies didn't know where the funding was coming from. So some of the universities knew that they were working with the CIA. Some of them just knew that they were getting government money to perform these experiments. What I love about, I love MK Ultra because it's like, here's the CIA trying to figure out how to control people's minds. What they wanted with LSD was a truth serum. Well, they didn't really. What they got was a truth serum. What they really wanted was an honesty serum. And that's not what they got. But they did get a truth serum because all these guys in these universities dosed on LSD and then became hippies. And the CIA inadvertently started the whole hippie movement, which they then monitored for the next 10 years. I mean, and by the way, I've said this to, some people who consider themselves hippies. Now they're kind of offended by it, as though the ideas of the hippies, well, that's not fair. You can't say that LSD, and I'm not saying that, by the way, just because LSD was involved in this whole movement doesn't make the movement any less powerful or important. Yeah. But the fact is that the CIA created hippies. Oops. That's the bottom line. So anyway, but it was about mind control. And I think the main thing that they learned from MK Ultra was, number one, LSD doesn't work. Hypnotism does work, but really the way that you control people is through group dynamics. And you can see that being used all the time now. Group dynamics is what controls this country. Group dynamics is what controls the Republicans and the Democrats. You can say anything to a Republican or a Democrat, and they are not going to, it's like a religious experience for them. They're not going to deny whatever it is that their party is espousing because they don't want to get kicked out of the group. Mm-hmm. And what's interesting about this is I think that this is something that's been known for ages and ages and ages. I mean, I think religions have used group dynamics to control people for millennia, right? And I think this goes back to the Bronze Age. But certainly it's being used now. And the main part I think that's being used now is it's great. We accidentally created hippies by accident with LSD. But the important part was knowing that torture and hypnotism work kind of hand in glove to be able to control the public. And one of the things that's really interesting in this book is that they said that hypnotism works twice as well on people who have a history of abuse, especially sexual abuse. And so when you look at things like 9/11, where essentially the whole country went through a form of abuse by watching that happen, it's much easier to understand how the government is able to control people by those kinds of means. And that's really, I think, what they discovered and what they learned in MK Ultra. And by the way, I think there's plenty of evidence to show they shut down the labs for MK Ultra, and that effectively went to a laboratory in Canada, and probably many of those experiments are still going on. We could go into more detail about those experiments. They were horrible, some of them was just, hey, let's dose people on. I mean, this was like kind of a joke, right? The CIA, what they were figuring is, hey, well, we don't want our Russian communist buddies dosing us on magic serums and not knowing how to react to that. So as a result, the CIA agents were secretly dosing each other, like at Christmas parties and shit. Because if you knew it was coming, then you'd be prepared for it. So it had to be by surprise. And so, like these things where they say, oh, if you take LSD, you'll jump off a building. Well, that actually happened one time because a couple of CIA agents were in a hotel in like Toronto or something like that. I forget where. And they dosed each other with LSD because that's standard protocol. and one guy had been having real problems with depression. And when they dosed him on LSD, he thought that they were against him and were making fun of him or whatever it was, and he threw himself out a window and died. But it was because of his history of depression, not because he was, dosing on LSD. But then for decades, we all learned, if you don't do LSD, kids, because you'll jump out a window. I mean, that came from a real incident, but that's not why it happened.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, so yeah,
No,
I think MK Ultra was incredibly important, and I think that's why they come out with TV shows like, Stranger Things, is to sort of take the teeth out of the reality of that thing. Let's turn it into a mystical cartoon where they're magic creatures from another dimension and all this bullshit. I mean, it was a fun show. Don't get me wrong. I enjoyed that show as much as anybody. But I think one of the purposes of it was people were waking up and learning that MK Ultra was a real thing. And so, let's have Hollywood diffuse this for us a little bit. And by the way, isn't that what's happening with UFOs right now?
Well, that's a good point. I was about to say, I think you see the same thing with the X-Files pre-Stranger Things, where things like Operation Paperclip, the project which was used to bring ex-Nazis and particularly scientists to America, in X-Files becomes part of some UFO extraterrestrial conspiracy. So it dilutes the hideousness perhaps of those things, and it does make them cartoonish, as you said, and it ties into this fantasy world instead of a very real intelligence operation or narrative.
Yeah It takes the teeth out of it by fictionalizing it or whatever.
Well, we got dark there at the end. We're literally at the end of the show now, but we could have gone on for hours. I know we've done it before when we haven't been on a show, so that's it's been great having you.
Well, I mean, let's face it, you could take any one of these subjects and probably talk for hours about it, right?
Talk for a whole episode. Is there? I don't know at the moment if there's anywhere that people can see The Revenant, because I think it's reverted to you, and you might be planning a re-release or something of that film. I always try to encourage people to watch it.
Yeah, it's yes to all those things.
Okay.
The rights did revert to me this year, and I'm not sure quite where that's going to land me.
Well, let us know. And the same with the Blair Rabbit Project, which I've had a number of people ask me where can they watch it. So,
is that right?
Yeah.
I'm not sure about that one. There's a whole conspiracy theory right there.
We have to do it. This original episode was titled "Kerry Prior Talks About Killer Rabbits," because that's when it was going to be at Midwest Weird Fest, so it was particularly relevant.
Yeah.
But I pulled out the killer rabbits when we had you on this time.
Look, hey, we could have a whole episode on rabbits.
Let's do
Evil
it.
rabbits have a real place in cinema, and I'm not quite sure I understand it. I'll have to look into that, because there must be some symbolism with the rabbit.
You know, there's Donnie Darko and there's Harvey.
Right.
I don't know if he's evil in Harvey, but he's a giant mystical rabbit. What is it called? A puka? I think it's a puka, right? The thought form or whatever. Harvey is in that great Jimmy Stewart movie.
There are more. I just saw something else where there was an evil rabbit.
I think there's a couple of horror movies, like, Bunny Man ones or something, which tie into some, urban legend about the Bunny Man killing you or something, but I'm not as familiar with those.
Wait, is the Bunny Man a real thing?
I don't know if it's real or not. Who can tell with those kind of, it becomes real. It's like Slender Man. People start talking about it, and then teenage girls are killing each other because Slender Man tells them to. So
I know. How trippy. I mean, there's a whole episode right there.
Another
episode bizarre.
Yeah.
Well, man, thank you so much for coming on. We definitely have to have you back and go down a literal. People always talk about in this industry going down the rabbit hole, but we'll literally go down the rabbit hole. We'll do a killer rabbit episode.
We should have a rabbit episode. Hey, it gives me a great excuse to dive in and start researching rabbits. I'm sure there's something there.
Oh yeah.
Let's do it. Well, thanks, man. And until we talk again, which will probably be soon, keep it weird.
Yes, keep it weird.
Thank you for joining us tonight. If you're interested in checking out more episodes, you can find us at talkingweird.com. If you haven't already, please like the show on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Talking Weird Podcast. Make sure you never miss an episode by subscribing to Talking Weird. We're available on most podcast platforms and YouTube. And if you do enjoy the show, please leave us a review. Dean and I would really appreciate it. Until then, stay safe and keep it weird.